you're welcome to do exactly that, going up onto the computer. So like I said, we just came back from a rabbinic, no, from a rabbinic conference where we have an opportunity to connect with fellow rabbis and to discuss matters that are relevant and pertinent to the community and how we can become better. Personally, I find that while I'm at a conference as this, there's the element of camaraderie, of friendship, of being with fellow colleagues and discussing matters that are not just matters relevant to the community, but just connecting with other rabbis, which you don't necessarily get a chance to do in other occasions. And that's why I personally enjoy going to the conference. But here's a question I got hammered with last night when I came back to my shul community. So somebody started saying, well, do rabbis have the authority, the right to make up laws? Now, I am a rabbi after all, so can I make up laws? Can I make up rules? Is it, whatever I'm in a mood of? Rabbis make up the law. What do you guys think? Yes, for real.
No.
Let me go back a little bit. Is halacha man-made, or is it divine, or is it something in between? Halacha means Jewish law. Is Jewish law made up by people, individuals, or does it come from the Torah? That's my question. Now, the reason why I was asked this question is because I was giving a shiur in Talmud, and in the Talmud, there's a lot of discussion about different aspects of Jewish law, and the Talmud clearly tells us this rabbi said this, and this rabbi said that. So one of the people attending the shiur says to me, but how could the rabbis make up law? Doesn't the Torah itself say you shouldn't add to the right or to the left? Don't add, don't subtract, right? So what are rabbis doing at a conference? Are we making up laws? Are we coming back and saying, we think it's a new idea, we should change the brands of coffee that people drink. We thought of a new idea like this and a new idea like that. Of course not, right? So in order to understand this, I thought, hey, there's no better place to look than this week's Parsha. As we know, every week we look in the Parsha for insights, for instruction. And yesterday you got a nice tutorial into the history of the South African Jewish community. Today, what I want to do with you is to take you a little bit back into halacha's history. Where does it come from? How do we understand Jewish law? And in fact, in this week's Parsha, it is addressed, but in a very interesting angle. It's called the Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder. Anyone here is an elder? We call this the Chabad Seniors Club because most of the people who participate are a little bit senior. Sometimes I also feel senior. My initials are AK, Ari Kievman. That stands for other stuff as well. So let us understand what this is and the way legal dissent and subversion were treated in biblical times. How did it work? How did that whole thing work? And perhaps we can understand from that how Jewish law is formulated. And if we look at the structure of Jewish judiciary, the nature of biblical exegesis, rabbinic law, and we'll just probe. Now, the truth is I prepared a lot of sources for today, and I don't think we're going to get through all of them. So what I'll do is some of them I'll put on the board, but we won't exactly read the texts. But I did prepare quite a bit, and we'll see what we could get through and what you can't. But that's the idea. I want to try to understand the extent of rabbinic authority and how we can treat human insight and innovation. Who can come up with laws? To what degree? What are the parameters? What are we allowed to do? And hopefully we'll answer or somewhat clarify the true nature of what is called the oral law, Torah Shebal Peh, and the extraordinary significance of our own role, why you're here, why we study, why when we come here we study Torah together, how to interpret it and how to apply it. Think, for example, how life has evolved. Have we had cell phones, 30 years ago? Did we have electricity 100 years ago? All these different things. How do we apply it to modern times? Now, since ancient times, of course, Jewish jurisprudence has been shaped by a distinction between biblical and rabbinic law. We know biblically the 613 commandments in the Torah. You cannot add, you cannot subtract. We know that. Now, of course, I gave you a vart. I don't remember. I'll just repeat it quickly because it's a great insight. Where the Torah, it's a vart from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, happened to be the father of the Rebbe. And he says, we know the Torah concludes with the letter Lamed, La'ene Kol Yisrael, and it starts with the letter Beis, very good. So that gives you the word Lev, which is the heart. And we also have the word Baal, Beis Lamed, from beginning to end was Baal. Baal means don't. The Torah last week's portion told us don't add, don't subtract, don't turn to the right, don't turn to the left. So let's go to the right of the word Baal. Okay, what's the letter to the right of the Beis? I did it with you last week. It's here on the recording as well. To the right of the Beis. Aleph. To the right of the Lamed. Chaf. Chaf. Aleph and Chaf. Spells the word Ach. Not Ach Shem or Ach Bru. What's Ach? In Hebrew, Ach means however. So, if a person decides, Jewish law is very nice. However, for me, it's not so convenient or anything like that. If you start adding however, but, don't do that. That's called subtracting. Let's go to the left of the word Baal. What's the letter to the left of the Beis? Gimel, very good. What's the letter to the left of the Lamed? Mem. What does that spell? Gam. What does Gam mean? Also, the Torah says these laws, but I also want to add, don't subtract. Just follow what the Torah tells us. So we have to know there's a distinction between what the Torah tells us, but what the rabbis enacted. In fact, the very first mission of Pirkei Avot, have you been studying ethics of our fathers, Pirkei Avot? Well, the very first Mishnah tells us, it says that our sages have added siyag la Torah. What's siyag la Torah? A fence to the Torah. Does the Torah need a fence? Yes, the sages add a fence. Why? Let's use an example. We know from the laws of Shabbos, deduced from the laws of building the tabernacle as the Jews did in the desert, that we're not allowed to create dyes to write words, right? You're not allowed to write on Shabbos. But our sages told us the pen itself is muktzah. You know what muktzah means? Forbidden to carry a pen on Shabbos. But why can't you carry the pen on Shabbos? Why not? Oh, that's offense to the Torah. Might lead to writing. Okay, is a man allowed to cohabit with a woman who's not his wife? Very good. I'm glad you got that. Moses came down from Mount Sinai. He said, I got good news and bad news. The good news is I got it down to 10 commandments. The bad news is thou shalt not commit adultery still in there. So that was just a joke. So now the sages told us don't even be in the same room, only one man and one woman who are not married to each other, if it's not your immediate family. Why not? Well, the sages said the temptation is too strong. So if a lady comes to visit me in my office here, I leave the door open. Leave it ajar. The sages have enacted laws that are called siyag la Torah, a fence, a gate to the Torah. The reason they enacted these laws, it's not the Torah law itself, but it's in order to help us to observe, to adhere to the Torah's laws, so that we don't come to accidentally transgress and violate them. With that in mind, we understand that at the end of the day, the distinction between the rabbinic and the biblical laws, even in temple times, while under Roman occupation in the land of Israel, there are accounts that describe a split in those days between different groups of Jews. Have you heard of that? I can't believe Jews split. What do they say? 2 Jews, 3 opinions? So maybe you may have heard of the Pharisees, the Prushim, or the Sadukim, the Sadducees. You've heard of them? The Sadducees, they rejected rabbinic authority. They insisted on a fundamentalist attachment to scripture, meaning if it isn't in the Torah, I don't want to hear it. That's it. Who gave these rabbis the power to interpret the Torah? No, don't tell me rabbinic law. And I get this all the time. There are people that tell me, where does it say so in the Torah? Oh, you can't give me a... It's the rabbis. Forget about it. I'm not going to listen to it. Who does that rabbi think? Oh, the rabbi I like. The rabbi I like. Okay, fine. That rabbi, all right. So, and by the way, as some of you know, I told this before. I was taking a walk. Not a walk. I had a meeting with Rabbi Masinter in Santon City. And we see a guy who looked quite Jewish. He had a beard. He had tzitzis, but no yarmulke on his head. So Rabbi Masinter and I thought maybe his yarmulke fell off. And I told Rabbi Masinter, just by the way, I was at a shul once at a function, and I was at the dais, sitting in the front. And I took off my hat, put it down. And then, I had a few drinks, and I had to go to the bathroom. When I came to the bathroom, I looked in the mirror, and I said, oy vey, I had no yarmulke on my head. I felt terrible. So right away, I put a serviette on top of my head, and I walked back to my place, and there was my yarmulke inside my hat. Sometimes it happens. You make a mistake. You take, especially if you wear a hat, as I do, took off my hat. The yarmulke was stuck in the hat. I felt really bad. Here, it's quite embarrassing. I was a rabbi sitting in front of this communal event without a yarmulke on my head, and nobody even said anything to me. Maybe they were trying to hint, and you don't know what they're saying. I was driving on the road yesterday, and somebody started flashing us. You know what I'm talking about? The headlights flashing. And I turned to my wife and said, what did I do wrong? Why is he flashing me? I don't know. She said, maybe there's police ahead. And 2 minutes later, we had our answer. Unfortunately, it was a terrible accident right ahead of us. And we saw, unfortunately, sadly, it looked fatal. So obviously, this person was flashing us to make us aware because it was a multiple vehicle pileup. So you never know what somebody's telling you. And if a guy's showing me, I don't know what he's trying to say in his head. What's he trying to tell me? I figured it out when I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. So I said to my colleague, Rabbi Masinter, probably this rabbi, I don't know who this rabbi is, but he looked rabbinic with a beard, tzitzis. Maybe he lost his yarmulke somewhere. But later on that day, I happened to be at the U.S. consulate to take care of some documents. And while I was there, Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, I see the same fellow. Now, it doesn't happen that you're making the mistake twice in the day that your yarmulke gets lost. So I turn to him and I say, but if you don't mind, I just want to ask you, I noticed that you don't wear a yarmulke, and it seems to me intentional. You're wearing tzitzis, but not a yarmulke. Is there a reason? Right away, he gets defensive. He says, you tell me where it says in the Torah you have to wear a yarmulke. So I said, it's not written in the Torah. We know that. It's a rabbinic enactment. In fact, many Sephardic Jews still don't wear yarmulkes because it wasn't their custom. So he says, that's why I don't wear a yarmulke. So I said, but that's interesting because you do wear tzitzis. He says, yes, that's in the Torah, he tells me. I said, I know, but usually it goes a person who keeps, he says he tells me he's a Karaite Jew. You ever heard of a Karaite? The Karaites were a group of Jews that exists still today, and as I met this individual, who had the same sentiments as the Tzedukim, the Sadducees. They only believed in the written Torah, but not in any of the oral rabbinic enactments. So if it's the rabbis, forget about it. Don't like them. You know the story about the Jew who was stranded on an island. This fellow, he winds up, some shipwreck, and he's stranded on an island. Now, when a Gentile stranded on an island, no offense, it's only a joke from Jackie Mason that I'm imitating. Jackie Mason says, Gentile knows how to go camping, and set up a camp, and, play some ball, have a nice braai, a bonfire. Jews right away figure out how we're going to make some money. So, we got space here. The Jew doesn't play the ball, he sells the ball. The Jew sees empty land, he's not going to go camping. What does the Jew know of camping? Jew sees how many condominiums, how many hotels, shopping centers can I build here, right? So this Yid, he built up the whole island, the whole place. Hotels, shopping centers, office complexes, developments. Eventually, the Israeli army comes to rescue him years later. And they see he built the whole place up. And he's very proudly showing them, look at all his establishments. He even built 2 shuls. So they ask him, how many Jews are there on the island that you built 2 shuls? He says, no, there's only me. He says, so why do you build 2 shuls for 1 Jew? He says, this is the shul I go to, and that's the shul I would never step foot into. You said it, not me. Yes.
You just repeated a theme of my 2 shirim from 2 days before.
Oh, is that how the community evolved? Otherwise, we would have had just 1 shul.
No, not quite.
If I had a secret microphone, that guy knows.
Oh, he's watching me.
Yeah, I was inspecting. This camera is there, don't you see? I was looking.
So, what I said, I started with the destruction of the Second Temple and the start of the diaspora. And basically what I said is wherever Jews go, they might start at the bottom as slaves, but sooner or later they're in positions of control and money. In every place they were exiled.
Well, people came here certainly as peddlers and starting off as immigrants, refugees, and built their way up. But the point I'm getting up to is, here you have a guy who's telling me, why should he wear a yarmulke? It's something, that's just something the rabbis came up with. So what does that really mean? Does he have a point? When he's telling me this, that the rabbis came up with it, do you have to listen to the rabbis? Is there any reason you should listen to it? Now, to tell you the truth, I want to tell all of you that many of the things that you do were not biblically enacted. They come from the rabbis. Think about most of our prayers were composed by rabbis. Yes, some of them are biblical. Many of the prayers come from King David and Tehillim and other biblical sources. But a lot of the prayers come from the rabbis. Ditto to all those blessings that we say. You wash your hands. It's rabbinic. What about polygamy? Do you know that according to Jewish law, polygamy is allowed? A man is allowed to have more than 1 wife. It was only with the invention of the credit card that was stopped. Don't stone me. I'm joking. It was a rabbi named Rabbeinu Gershom. He stopped it. He put a ban on polygamy. What about lighting Hanukkah candles? Is that in the Torah anywhere? Utterly rabbinic. And the same goes for huge swaths of the laws that we observe on Shabbos and Yom Tov and kosher and financial law and so many of the things that we do. In fact, when listing the 613 commandments, Maimonides, let's just look here. I put some texts here. We'll look through some of them. He argues that none of these rabbinic innovations should be included in the final count of the 613 commandments. And here he says, in general, were we to include the rabbinic enactments in the count of the 613 mitzvahs, right? Every positive precept and every prohibition of rabbinic origin, their number would amount to how many? Thousands, he says. There's thousands of laws. So when we say 613 mitzvahs, are we talking about the rabbinic enactments? No, we're talking about the biblical commandments. Nevertheless, despite the importance of this distinction, this demarcation between scriptural Torah law and the rabbinic laws, our Torah portion this week seems to blow up the distinction altogether, or at least puts it into question. Let's read a little bit of this week's Parsha. If you have a Chumash in front of you, you could read the Hebrew words, and I will try to translate as we go along. You know what? I have the Hebrew in front of me, the English behind me, so let's go word side by side. The verse says, Ki yipalim imcha davar lemishpat. if a matter eludes you in judgment, bein dam ledam, whether it's a matter of blood and blood, meaning, if somebody harmed one another, if a person hurt another, or God forbid, worse than that, bein din ledin, or when it comes to judgment and judgment, which means litigation, right? There has to be some way to ubein nega lenega, or between lesion and lesion. Divrei ribais b'sharecha, words of dispute in your cities, says the Torah, v'kamta v'alis alamakim, then you should rise up, you should go to, now here when it says to the Lord that Hashem your God chooses, it's referring to the place that Hashem your God chooses. It's referring to the temple where the Sanhedrin was stationed. Sanhedrin was the court of Jewish law. Okay, that's where they were stationed. Now the truth is, in every city, there were Sanhedrins, there were courts. Okay, there were courts of Jewish law. Call it the Supreme Court of Jewish Justice was in Jerusalem. Where is the Supreme Court in South Africa? Bloemfontein? Yes? Okay. Well, I know this country is wonderful. 3 capitals: Cape Town, Bloemfontein, Pretoria. Where I come from, the capital is Washington, D.C. That's where the Supreme Court of Justice is. Although every state has its Supreme Courts as well. But we're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, just like every state has its court, as I was driving yesterday, you leave Gauteng, you enter Mpumalanga, and you see, it says there, right when you come in, Mpumalanga Magistrates Court. And every city you go to in South Africa will have, different courts, and its own, perhaps, bigger and smaller courts, for lack of a better term, in Judaism as well. A Jewish court had to have a minimum of 3 judges, but there was a local Supreme Court had 23 judges. And the biggest Supreme Court at the Sanhedrin had 71 judges. But only major matters of litigation, not even litigation, usually it was probably about a person, we're talking about capital sentencing and things like that. Only such major matters came to the high court, which makes sense, right? Before it gets to the Supreme Court, it has to go through the smaller courts. Okay, let's read the verses. You should come to the Levitic Kohanim and to the judge who will be in those days. Let's just read it in English so we just get that. And you should inquire, and they will tell you the words of judgment. And you should do according to the word that they tell you from the place Hashem God chooses. And you shall observe and do according to all the instructions that they instruct you. According to the law that they instruct you and according to the judgment that they say to you, you shall do. And you should not divert from the word that they tell you. And according to the law they instruct you and according to the judgment that they say to you, you should do. You should not divert from the word they tell you, either right or left. Remember what I told you before about right or left? Not to add, not to subtract. Don't digress, don't divert. Final verse. And the man who does presumptuously and is not hearkening unto the priest who stands to minister before the Lord, your God, or unto the judge, even that man shall die, and you shall exterminate the evil from Israel. Okay, without getting into the weeds just yet. The Torah is saying that in matters of legal doubt, who are we to consult with? Well, there were sages, judges. So the Torah is commanding us to adhere to the rabbinic authority right here in this verse. But if the Torah is telling us to follow the sages, wouldn't that mean that all rabbinic law, in fact, is scriptural in that sense? Because the Torah says you should listen to what the sages, what the judges tell you. In fact, I was in a shul, I remember this distinctly, it was here in this country about 19 years ago, where the rabbi got up, this week's Parsha, and he gave a whole speech. I only found out afterwards he was fired by the committee. So his sermon that Shabbos was, you should listen to the judges and the officers. And who are the judges and officers today? None other than the rabbis. So he was imploring to his community that he should stay in his job and his position, and they have no right to let him go, to terminate his contract. What I want to understand is we see here, this is a sort of a source for rabbinic authority. but we have to understand to what degree does it go? What are the rabbis allowed or not allowed to tell us when they're making up laws? To what degree do the rabbis have an authority? Okay? We see here the Torah tells us that the sages are consulted in matters of legal doubt, but I want to try to understand what is the nature of this rabbinic authority? To what degree? And does it apply to you and me? So to better understand the place of and the power of the rabbinic interpretation, let's take a closer look at the laws that are presented in these verses that we read here in our parsha. And here it tells us about an individual called a Zaken Mamre. It's in our parsha. The rebellious elder. Are you a rebellious elder? I will tell you one thing, that in the 1960s, I wasn't around yet then, but in the 1960s, there was a big movement going on, the hippies. In New York, there was an area called Woodstock. Did it come to South Africa as well? Yes? Okay, that's right. And back then, a lot of the rabbis were saying, "Oy vey, what are we going to do? Our youth, they're rebelling. They're going off." The Rebbe had a different perspective. The Rebbe said, this is a great sign. They want change. They want to see things better. And the Rebbe's perspective was one that we have to embrace the rebellion of the youth. So maybe we have to embrace the rebellion of the elders. What's the rebellion? Let's hear. But before we can understand what is it that we're dealing with, this dissenting senior, what is it? We have to understand the judicial system that is set forth in the Torah, because it's not so simple when you just read the text and see, oh, there's a rebellious elder. Who is this rebellious elder? What's this about? What's he doing? Now, since the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, the chief judiciary authority of Israel was known as, I told you before, just see if you remember, Sanhedrin. Very good. 71 judges who presided over the judicial system, and they were presided by one leader. He was called a Nasi. What's the Nasi? The prince, the leader. Okay? Who was the first Nasi? Let's see here, remember. Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses. But beneath this supreme Sanhedrin, as we explained, there was a whole judicial chain that included various other senior courts and extended, each city had their minor, I don't know what they were called, Sanhedrins, courts. And these smaller courts had fairly broad powers. But questions of national importance or more obscure areas of Jewish law that perhaps the great judges of these smaller courts maybe weren't familiar with them. I like to say that rabbis are somewhat like GPs. Why? Your typical rabbi knows a little bit about a bunch of things. I don't know everything, even if sometimes I claim I do. We know a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I think it was Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he lived 100 years ago. He said these days people know less and less about more and more. I feel like that about myself. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. So the rabbis, to a tremendous degree, are like GPs. We have a general knowledge of a bunch of things, but not the specific details. If you go even to our Beth Din right here in Johannesburg, they have Dayanim who spoke and presented to us at this conference that I just returned from. And they gave their presentations. Each of the Dayanim spoke about their area of expertise. One is an expert in the laws of kashrut, and therefore he supervises a whole team of rabbis and mashgichim who go out to industrial factories that are manufacturing food, and they inspect to see if these productions could be kosher. And maybe another one is an expert in the laws of marriages, and therefore this particular dayan, this rabbi, will teach the other rabbis and oversee how we conduct and officiate marriages, and if necessary, the termination of a marriage, divorces, and similar matters, and maybe another one's an expert in jurisprudence and litigation. First taste what I'm saying? So I can't rule on these types of matters. So if a dayan in any of those supreme Sanhedrins in those cities wasn't an expert, they had to consult with a nasi in the higher system. Let me just share this with you. Yes, it came about from Yitro. It was Yitro's advice. Yitro said to Moshe, you can't handle it all alone. So here it is. If you want, we can read the laws inside it very simply. This is Maimonides describing to us how it worked. Okay, here he goes. When the Supreme Sanhedrin was in session, there were never any prolonged differences of opinion amongst the Jewish people. Instead, if a doubt arose in a Jew's mind over any law, he would inquire in the court in his city. If they did not know, the questioner and that court or its agents would ascend to Jerusalem and ask the court that holds sessions on the Temple Mount. If they knew, they will reply to him. If they did not know, everyone comes to the court that holds sessions at the entrance of the temple courtyard. If they know, they will reply. If they do not know, everyone comes to the chambers of the hewn stone, to the Supreme Sanhedrin, and presents the question. If the matter that was unresolved by all the others was known to the Supreme Sanhedrin, either as part of the oral tradition or because of its derivation through the principles of exegesis, they relate the decision immediately. If, however, the decision was unclear to the Supreme Sanhedrin, they deliberate about the matter during that time, and they debate it back and forth until they reach a uniform decision or until a vote is taken. How many rabbis were on that board to vote? 71, very good. In such a situation, they follow the majority, and then all the questioners, this is the halacha, questioners then all depart. So, why was it 71? In order to have an odd number, to have a majority. Very good. After the Supreme Sanhedrin was nullified. When was it nullified? Towards the end, or actually no, after the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin still remained in place for some time. I don't remember for how long, but it remained in place in Israel. Even after the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin moved to a city called Yavna. You heard of Yavna? You remember a few weeks ago was Tisha B'Av, and I related to you how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, after his courageous escape from Jerusalem in a coffin, he came to Vespasian, who was the Roman general, who later was promoted to become the Roman emperor. And he asked him, he was granted 3 requests. One of his famous requests was, Ten li Yavne b'chachameh. He asked Vespasian to please give him, to grant him Yavne and its scholars. Because once the temple was destroyed, they moved the Sanhedrin, I'm almost certain, from Jerusalem to Yavne. But unfortunately, it's sometime later, the Romans disbanded it, they forbade it, and in fact, there was a whole story the Talmud relates, how one of the great sages, I'm forgetting who it was, wanted to give smicha, and because the Romans said you can't give smicha to any rabbis, they didn't want this chain of rabbinic ordination to continue, and this rabbi went and gave it to a bunch of rabbis, and they fled in different directions, and the rabbi was executed by the Romans. Very sad and interesting story. The point we're making here is that the decisions reached by the Supreme Sanhedrin, the decisions that were reached by the Supreme Sanhedrin were decisive. They were decisions that were made and had to be followed. Once the majority of the court issued a ruling, as Maimonides describes it here, became binding, and this goes back to what the verses we read before in the Torah says, as the sages say, so shall you do. This was the system of how that was decided. Yeah.
Where and when was the Gemara Yerushalmi written?
Yerushalmi.
Yeah.
The Jerusalem Talmud was written in Israel.
Wasn't it in Yavne?
Oh, you're saying specific city? It could be. I'm not certain. I would imagine.
I've got something in my head that says
Could be.
written in Yavne.
Could be.
Which means it was there for longer than you're saying.
It didn't last that long. The Romans eventually disbanded the Sanhedrin. But I can't tell you for certain, but I do believe it was during that time. Now look here what Maimonides says. Let's read this. Maimonides continues. He says, the rebellious elder that we read in this week's Parsha, by contrast, is one of the sages of Israel who has received the tradition from previous sages and issued rulings with regard to the words of Torah, as do all the sages of Israel. So what's he rebellious about? So Maimonides tells us. His rebellion involves an instance when he has a difference of opinion in one of the Torah's laws with the supreme Sanhedrin and did not accept their views, but instead issued a ruling to act in a different manner. Yeah, the majority of the sages ruled one way. He says, I disagree. Could a country, say here in South Africa, if a particular judge disagrees with the Constitution or with a binding law, can he or she decide otherwise? What would happen to our country if somebody decides to dissent, to deviate from what the actual law, the enactment was? Okay? So Rambam here says, though he analyzes and they analyze, he received the tradition and they received the tradition. The Torah granted the Sanhedrin deference, even if the court desires to forego their honor and to allow him to live, they're not allowed, so that differences of opinion will not arise within Israel. This doesn't mean that a person cannot have an opinion. Right? You're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. How are facts determined? Well, we said before, the Sanhedrin would take a vote if they needed to, if it wasn't a clear matter. And if they decided a rule by majority, this one individual cannot decide that he or she feels otherwise and dissent. Notwithstanding, maybe he's a very wise, scholarly, proficient individual and has brilliant ability of analysis and capacity for judgment and traditions that he received. But he has to set all that aside and accept the rulings of the colleagues, of his colleagues in the Sanhedrin. Why? Because this is the way Jewish law was determined, that it would be decided by a majority rule in the Sanhedrin. Yeah?
What happens if there's an abstention? Were they allowed to abstain from voting?
I wonder.
Number one, I do understand if I'm not mistaken. The youngest judge had his opinion first.
Right. Yeah, it was a very clever idea to prevent, what happens, say, Aubrey is a very scholarly, sagacious, venerable sage. He's a few years older than me. Aubrey gives a ruling, and now who am I to argue with Aubrey? So I wouldn't want to give a different opinion. Very good point. So they would go youngest to oldest, so that the elder would be able to give his opinion last. But nevertheless, the elder had to accept the ruling if the majority ruled one way, and he couldn't say, but I feel otherwise. There was a story, you might be familiar with the story of, I'm forgetting which scholar, Rabbi Eliezer, I think it was, Ben Hyrcanus, was it him? I'm not sure, I don't remember which it was. But he was very strong in his belief that the law was a certain way. And in fact, he caused all types of miracles. He said, if the law is like me, let the wall of this building move. And the wall moved. And the sages said, but that's not the way we judge law. He said, if the law is like me, let the water reverse itself. And the tide of the water went backwards. And the sages said, that's not how we're going to prove Jewish law, just because you could conduct magic or have connections in heaven. Jewish law is decided, as the Torah tells us, in this fashion, with a majority rule. Yeah.
What happens if there's an even number because somebody's away or somebody's ill?
No, the Sanhedrin only was in session with all 71 judges present. And I don't think abstention was an option. I don't think so. It doesn't make sense that it was. It was usually ruled one way or another. They had to take a stance.
And besides, they wanted to speak all 70 languages.
Yeah, there were very high qualifications to be included in the Sanhedrin. But my question to you right now is, why do we have such a hard line in Judaism against dissent? What's wrong? Again, he's entitled to his opinion, but he can't now say, everybody follow me. We're not talking here about a person having a difference of opinion. Obviously, in 71 judges, 35 rule like this, 36 like that. There's a difference of opinion. We're not saying they can't have a difference of opinion. We're saying is once the rule was decided, you cannot tell your students, don't follow it, follow me.
You want unity.
Yeah, we need to have that unity. Yes.
I just wanted to crack a joke.
Oh, go ahead.
Because it's very difficult for a bunch of Jews to agree.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Torah is saying that they have to come to an agreement. They have differences of opinion. That's true. You're entitled to difference of opinion. But there has to be one final rule. Otherwise, we're going to have anarchy. We can have, even in Pirkei Avot, it says to pray for the welfare of a government. What if you don't like the ANC? You still pray for their welfare. Why? Because even if it's a government that you don't like, or even if it's a provenly bad and corrupt and terrible government, there's two things we don't talk about in this shul: religion and politics.
In Russia, you speak about and have a prayer
They used to pray for the Tsar. May God keep him healthy, well, and far away from us. Yeah, that was from Fiddler on the Roof. The Rambam, as you can see here, he seems to imply that if there's to be any continuity or unity of Jewish tradition, then there has to be some kind of mechanism for resolving conflict, which obviously why we as a Jewish community have a Beth Din. What happens when people have differences of opinion and they come to a deadlock, a situation where they just can't resolve it? Well, there's mediation and there's litigation. There's a way to deal with it. And if you can't deal with it, that can be a problem. And if we're not going to accept what the sages, what the scholars, what the judges rule, then that's a big problem. And that's why we have this type of rule. And that's why the Torah itself tells us that it is a zaken mamre. It might be a very scholarly, venerable, sagacious, wise, academic, and knowledgeable, and all the other wonderful epithets you want to give to this individual. By the way, the word zaken, which means old, our sages tell us also means wise. Even though zaken is a shekana chachma. Why? Because with age comes a certain accumulation of wisdom. Experience, exactly. That's why you stand up for an elderly person. And in fact, they tell a story once on the bus in Israel. Elderly person gets on and nobody stood up. So the driver, he got out of his seat and he told the senior citizen, "Here, take my seat. You could drive the bus if you want, but I'm not going to drive the bus unless you have a seat." Sometimes it takes a little bit of that chutzpah. But if well, that was a last resort. It wasn't immediately go execute. If he weren't to mend his ways. We're talking about an individual. The execution was last resort. Of course, they first tried to convince him in a pleasant and peaceful manner to not be dissenting and not to rebel and not to cause this whole hoo-ha. And it had to be done the way any execution in Jewish law was done, in a very fair manner. It was the last option. It wasn't like you just execute. Judaism was not ISIS. I think so. But right, but you know what the rule was? A Sanhedrin that executed somebody more than once in 70 years was considered a murderous Sanhedrin. So it wasn't so simple that they just went and executed him. This person had to really be rebelling and dissenting and fighting and not, and not conceding to them. What's that? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now think about it. At the end of the day, if we didn't have these types of laws in place, then, if every person with some kind of familiarity with Jewish law was licensed to issue rules, and each person decides, I want it my way, then what happens with the law at the end of the day? Instead of the people of the book, we would look a lot more like people of the Balkans, with a new nation seemingly spinning off every few years or so. Just a moment, I'll take questions in a moment. I see it. I see all the hands up, but yes. Instant. Okay, go ahead.
You asked what did it look like?
Yeah.
It looked like a Liberta, driving along a Liberta.
Yes, exactly. So here we have another commentary, the Chinuch. I'm putting it on the board. And he explains the rationale for enforcing the deference to rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, that we need to do so. And he states as follows, that mortal minds diverge from each other, and a great many minds will never achieve consensus about anything. So God knew that if each individual was given the ability to determine the meaning of the Torah according to their own understanding, disagreement on the meaning of the Torah laws would proliferate. And the Torah would become a multitude of Torahs. We want to avoid that. And therefore, God Almighty, Master of all wisdom, complemented our Torah, Torah's emes, the Torah of truth, with this mitzvah. We're commanded to follow it in accordance with the true interpretation as received by our ancient sages. Furthermore, in every generation we are to listen to those sages amongst us who have received the tradition from those who preceded them, drank the waters of their works, and labored extensively over days and nights to understand the profundity of their words and the wondrousness of their opinions. By accepting this, we will align with the true path of Torah knowledge. Without it, if we are seduced by our own thoughts and the poverty of our opinion, we will not succeed at all. Interesting that he says the poverty of our opinion, because obviously these sages, there were many qualifications to be a member of the Sanhedrin. But nevertheless, even with all those qualifications, it went with a majority rule. And no matter how strongly you felt about your opinion, at the end of the day, we had to follow the majority law. Without any kind of, there were no exceptions to it. You had to follow the law, and this was very clearly stated. It was important to safeguard, to protect this, the prevention of this, what's the word I'm looking for? This perversion of the law. Okay? So the halachic authority of the day, they needed to maintain a united front. And even though maybe one of the sages, or maybe many of the sages, felt a difference of opinion, there had to be a protocol to determine which way we're going to go. Remember, it's a very close tie if it's 35, 36, 71 sages. But we follow the 36, not the 35. Even though those 35 may be the elder, or may be the smarter, or may be better, they had to concede to the others. Absolutely. But they always had to have a consensus, a final verdict that went one way or the other. Now, of course, there had to be certain rules. There were conditions that had to be applied, right? So, for example, he couldn't just dissent. This individual had to actually instruct others, the public. He had to get up on TV and tell everybody, don't listen to the Sanhedrin, listen to me, right? He had to go out there promoting his way and saying that, he's fighting against them. It wasn't just that he had a difference of opinion, as we know very clearly. And the laws are only triggered while the Sanhedrin are actually presiding. So if today it happens that you have a different rabbi, who has a different opinion, we don't today do these types of things. We're not going to execute, I don't know, I don't want to mention names in our community, but we know there's differences of opinion, right? And it's interesting because for over a century, I think there was only one Beth Din here. Still is only one Beth Din. But now we have a second kashrut authority starting up. Many people don't like it. Some people see the benefit in it. Others don't. But there's no authority today to, even if you don't like it, to do anything to them. It's a free country. And there's no law in Judaism against it. So these laws obviously don't apply today. But what area of law is the rebellious elder dissenting? And the Mishnah tells us that this law could be triggered in the case of someone who disputes rabbinic opinion regarding the performance of mitzvahs, but not if the disputes are about an explicit biblical commandment itself, which is something very interesting. So, for example, the mitzvah of tefillin is recorded in the Torah, but many of its details, like the number of compartments inside the tefillin, are not written explicitly in the Torah. They actually depend on rabbinic hermeneutics or on other ways of interpreting, of transmission of certain traditions. So if someone disputes one of those rabbinic hermeneutics, whatever you want to call it, they are not executed. In fact, we see that there are differences in tefillin, which is why in Chabad we wear Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Some people wear up to 4 pairs of tefillin. Why? Because we're saying here is that there's different ways of interpreting actually the Torah law itself, and this is something that's described in the Mishnah. So here, let me just read it to you. I skipped what's that? Let me just see what happened. I skipped the text. I apologize. Let me just see if I can find it. Did I put it in the next one? No. Okay, you'll have to just bear with me. The Mishnah says that there's a greater stringency regarding the words of the sages than regarding the words of the Torah. Okay, meaning, if a rebellious sage says that there's no mitzvah of tefillin in order to transgress the Torah law, then we don't punish him. But if he rules that the tefillin contain 5 compartments instead of 4, okay, so he is arguing with the rabbis, then he's liable. Well, what we're discussing here is that a matter of Torah itself can be debated by the sages, how to interpret the Torah. You would think it should be the opposite. You would think that when it comes to a biblical matter, it should be more strict. When it comes to rabbinic matters, it should be less so. But it seems here that it's the opposite. It seems that my computer has died. So we're going to have to just deal without the computer for now. I'll read to you one more insight from Nachmanides, and as it's 11:30, I will let you go for lunch. And maybe you're giving a shirt tomorrow. Okay, so maybe I will continue this theme next week, just because we didn't even get a chance to cover half of what I wanted to share with you today. Let me just conclude by reading Nachmanides to you. He says, here is the pure, unadulterated truth. The prohibition against diverting from the teachings of the sages applies only to their interpretation of the Torah via Gzera Shava. That's a textual comparison. Gzera Shava is where they compare 2 types of verses and come up with a law. But there's another way, it's called Binyan Av, which is establishing a general principle, and the other 13 principles of hermeneutics. What am I talking about? In the morning before davening, we read Rabbi Yishmael Eimer B'Shloish Esrei Midos HaTorah Nidreshes, that the Torah is interpreted by 13 methods. Exactly, it goes to the Kal V'chomer, and Nachmanides says it's only if they deem something to be prohibited or permitted based on scriptural exegesis, direct inference, or by tradition from Moshe, and this elder person deems it otherwise, then he is obligated to subordinate his opinion to theirs and believe what they said. Meaning, 35, 36, the 35 are going to have to subordinate themselves to the 36. However, as for the rulings and decrees that the sages have made to safeguard the Torah as a fence for it, they are only indirectly supported by this prohibition. The laws of the rebellious elder do not apply to them, and certainly one instructs others to violate them or does so himself does not transgress this biblical prohibition. Such a person is not in any way the subject of this punishment that the Torah tells us on how to deal with this individual. So in other words, there are various categories of rabbinic legal teachings. What are they? Teachings based on direct scriptural inference, those inferred through the application or of more complex methods of interpretation of Torah. There's oral traditions that have been transmitted, meaning it's not written in the Torah anywhere. This is, how do we know it? Tell me where it says it. Nowhere. You want to know, as Tuvia put it? Tevye put it, excuse me. Tradition, 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 tradition. That's it. And then, of course, there are original decrees that were made by rabbis. And actually, we say that it's the rabbinic enactments themselves that are most stringent. And that we're going to have to discuss, maybe, please God, next week. We'll try to go into understanding why it is that the rabbinic laws and interpretations are even more strict than the biblical ones. Ladies and gents, I don't know, I see here somebody's message. Okay, no, it's not related to this. All right, we'll continue this, please God, next week. Thank you all for joining. Please enjoy the lunch wherever you